Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, welcome to African News Review, our weekly conversation where we look at the coverage of Africa in the media and deconstruct the stories. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is journalist, publisher, Blackstar News, Comrade Milton Allimadi. Welcome to the show.
Santos.
Yes, welcome is usually the voice of Africa to anyone that comes to the continent, but it seems that France has overstayed its welcome in Chad. Because going to the first news of today, we just learned that Chad has now broken up its defense pact with France. And for that story, we go to the AP Associated Press, which reads, Chad ends a defense cooperation agreement with its former colonial ruler, France. The story is filed by Sam Menik. And it is, we read the lead, which says Dakar, Senegal AP, Chad's government said it's ending a defense cooperation agreement with France in order to redefine the national sovereignty from the former colonial ruler. The decision marks a historical turning point since the Central African nation gained independence more than 6 decades ago. It said its decision to end the agreement, which allows Chad to redefine its strategic partnership in line with national priorities. Before we delve in, what do you think that means?
It means that the military ruler, Mahamat Idris Deby,
Yep. The son of
is watching what's happening in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Yeah, son of the former military ruler, Idris Deby, who was killed. When was it? Over a year now? 2 years.
2 years, in fact. Yes.
Right. But I don't know why they say it's such a historic turning point. I guess it's historic in the sense that when Mahamat succeeded his father, he was roundly endorsed by France, and Macron went there for a swearing in. That's so funny. Look at the contradiction. They talk about, the coup belt in Africa and how military rulers are undermining democracy, as if just having a civilian
changes anything
is in itself democracy, right? Very funny definition. But they're saying the military are undermining civilian rule. And then he goes there and he sits right next to the new military ruler, Mahamat Deby. But what Mahamat has realized, and I think we discussed this in one of our earlier episodes, where I suggested that the situation in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and Mali, and I said even if any one of those military rulers had their own personal agenda for seizing power, it's not within their own hands anymore. The public are supporting military takeover so long as it also involves taking control of their sovereignty, kicking out French military forces and French control over their politics and the economy, and getting a better deal for their resources. That's what the people care about. And obviously, Chad cannot stand alone and say, oh no, we're going to continue with the old way of embracing neocolonialism and French control and French military forces present in our country. Because if you risk being overthrown by other officers,
Yeah. Yeah.
younger officers who are also following what's transpiring in other West African countries, and they're perhaps eager to become a part of the new alliance of states of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. So he may be doing it to save his own neck as well. But it also suggests to me that the military rulers in Gabon and Guinea are most likely facing the similar pressure. I would not be shocked in the next several weeks or months if we see a similar outcome in those two countries.
Okay. So, I would read further. Goes into, it says, Chad was one of the last countries in the region where the French maintained a large military presence and have been ousted in recent years from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, what you alluded to earlier, after years of fighting Islamic extremists along the regional troops. These countries have each closer to Russia, which has mercenaries deployed across the Sahel, the vast expanse below the Sahara. So you're thinking that it is both strategic, but also can you read into how the AP is spinning that story?
Yeah, but it's not just the AP. The AP is just echoing Western political statements and agenda.
Okay.
And to me, here's the bigger problem. The bigger problem is how European corporate media are very dangerous, right?
Okay.
We talk about weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction does not only involve destructive manufactured arms, correct?
Yeah.
Weapons of mass destruction or distraction can also be corporate media. They're very dangerous because the most important thing is to have a conscious, well-informed public. Then they're able to protect themselves better, you see? That's always been my argument. Okay. That's why I'm not a very big fan of much of the corporate media. Now, you talk about independent journalism, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
But how independent are you if you're just parroting Western government agenda? You surrender your capacity to be critical. And we saw that with very disastrous outcomes in Libya. When even so-called independent media were they became cheerleaders, just cheering on the NATO aggression. And I'm sure some of them now may have some regret because look at where Libya is now. They were uncritical in covering the NATO, US, French, and British war on Libya and the destruction of the Libyan state. So now here is that what these military governments are doing, they're jeopardizing the safety of the citizens of their countries because they're displacing the French military presence and bringing the Russian mercenaries instead.
Okay.
So they're implying that the war against the quote-unquote jihadists had been successful when the French or the U.S. were there. And of course, the answer is no. So how is that not mentioned in a story when you're discussing French forces, U.S. forces, Russian forces, and the fight against the quote-unquote jihadists? You're not mentioning the possibility that because there's been no significant advance or success while the French and the Americans are there, so perhaps these guys just want to try something different. Is that not logical?
It is logical.
So why would you not include something logical like that? It does not say that perhaps with the Russians they're going to succeed now, but it's still logical that they might want to try something different. You see? And any sensible journalist would be able to explore that angle. But when you confine yourself to just parroting the Western government's view.
Mm.
You're destroying your own credibility as a journalist. You are providing a disservice to the reading public by giving them insufficient information.
Yeah.
It's called an agenda. You right?
Yeah.
Agenda. You're now just basically parroting the agenda of Western government.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Basically just pumping out propaganda in the name
Absolutely.
of
That's the word for it, propaganda.
Mm-hmm. And
I like the fact that, you know what, because when they talk about propaganda, they don't just talk about African media. The AP, the BBC, CNN, New York Times. No, we are sophisticated journalists, we only stick to the facts. Complete nonsense. And that is why we need more shows like this so we can deconstruct their hypocrisy.
Yes. We call on more voices to the village square, because the more voices you have, the more it reverberates around. And it's
Absolutely.
not just, it's not about sitting on the throne. It's about echoing the thoughts of 1.4 billion at the moment and counting. So speaking of echoing the thoughts of 1.4 billion, we go for our next story from the Telegraph. And this time it's about Eid, which is about that time of Christmas. Or as they will say, do they know it's Christmas in Africa? So the story comes from the Daily Telegraph, and it's titled Ed Sheeran, I Wish I Wasn't on the new Band Aid song. The singer performed on Do They Know It's Christmas in 2014, and his voice has been used on a new version to mark 40 years since Band Aid. And the story goes, it's filed in by Anita Singh. Ed Sheeran is unhappy his vocals have been used on a Band Aid 40 anniversary single, suggesting the initiative perpetuates damaging stereotypes of Africa. However, Ed Sheeran said in a post on Instagram, my approval wasn't sought on this new Band Aid 40 release, and had I had the choice, I would have respectfully declined the use of my vocals. A decade on, and my understanding of the narrative associated with this has changed. This is just my personal stance. I'm hoping it's a forward-looking one. Love to all, he says. Now, why is that important? He linked to a post in which Fuse ODG, that's a Ghanaian British rapper, real name Richard Abi. 10 years ago, I refused to participate in Band Aid because I recognize the harm initiatives like this inflicts on Africa. While they may generate sympathy and donations, they perpetuate damaging stereotypes that stifles Africa's economic growth, tourism, and investment, ultimately costing the continent trillions, destroying its dignity, pride, and identity. By showcasing dehumanizing imagery, these initiatives fuel pity rather than partnership, discouraging meaningful engagement. Your take on this new problem, as they will say?
No, actually, it's not a problem. I like it. It's an awakening.
Okay.
I really respect this musician whom I'm not that familiar with, but I always really have profound respect for any European person anywhere in the world, whether European in Europe or European in the United States, to acknowledge that they had a false media created image of Africa, and to say that they've now learned. We need more people like him speaking out to convince other Europeans to go through that process as well.
Okay.
This is profound. This is a person who needs, I hope he writes an op-ed about his transformation. The quotes that he delivered is very powerful because here's part of the problem. The problem is that Europeans, even the ones who want to be good and mean well, they've been fed so much propaganda of demonization that even when they discover that, well, what they thought they knew was false, number one, they're reluctant to admit it, you see, because it involves re-examining a lot of the past, correct? And admitting that much of my knowledge when it comes to Africa, African descendants, is misinformed. And if I acknowledge that, then of course I have to change some of my conduct and beliefs, toward them. That's the first part.
Yeah.
The second part is that many Europeans find it difficult to accept that they can learn anything from an African. So that's why it's very bold for this artist, this musician, to admit that he was schooled by a Ghanaian artist. And when you read the quotes, these are very powerful quotes from a Ghanaian artist who is obviously very conscious and knows the impact of the distortion of the perception of Africa in the Western world. So kudos and much congratulations to both of them, the European who's willing to learn and the African from Ghana who has taught this European. I have much respect for both of them.
Okay. I want to also add...
And the final point I would like to add is that I would like to see more of this kind of dynamics in different situations. We should not leave it only for the artists. We should leave it for Africans and Europeans in various different professions to come out and say, this is what I learned and this is what I taught. And truly, that is how we create a better world. When more people like that, like these two, are willing to be involved in that type of engagement and then reveal it to the rest of the world.
Yes. And speaking of engagement, I want to read from a certain book titled Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media, to show where that sort of imagery, like he said, showcasing dehumanizing imagery, comes from. It's an epigraph from chapter 4 of the book, Africa's Alleged Docility. And it which is today will be between Kenya and Tanzania. And one more. Yeah, one more from the book. Hold on, one more from the book. In its 1897 book, Rise of Our East African Empire, Lord Lugard, who happened to have been the one who amalgamated the Nigeria's North and Southern Protectorate, writes, with the conquest of what is now Uganda and Kenya, any white man, even one belonging to the lowest social class, was superior to any African. That intense dissertation of control which animates our tectonic plates does not exist among the tribes of Africa, Lugard claimed. Could you tell them where you got this information from?
So that just addresses what I just said.
Yes.
If you are fed that type of nonsense by Lugard, why would you as a European ever believe you could learn anything from an African, you see?
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies the problem. We still deal with that challenge even up today. So you have European experts on Africa when we have African PhDs all over the world now, but they would rather bring a European expert to comment about a situation in Africa.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas when Africans are covering Europe, of course, they bring a European expert on Europe, right?
True.
Not an African expert on Europe.
No, you would never have.
We have to change that dichotomy, really. And that's part of the reason we have these types of conversations. You know?
Yes. And before we go any step further, it will also be on the, will be remiss of me if I do not provide some text as to how majority of these stereotypes get into mainstream media. There is a book titled The Africa That Never Was, written by Jablo and Hammond.
Yeah, that's a great book, and that book benefited me during my research as well.
Yeah, so I got the book on when I was looking through when I went through the reference points of how you got your information. I was like, okay, we need to get that. So that book is essentially talking about 500 years of British writing about Africa, the demonization. You could see it through, pulsing through their literature, from Dickens to Shakespeare to Kipling to, the name goes on and on. So
and those were two American scholars, by the way.
Yes, yeah.
Who sometimes it's easier for outsiders to actually do a effective critical analysis,
Yes. And, and if you think that was the past, I enjoin people to actually do a little field research. If you go on Google now and you are to enter this search parameter, images of Africa, you will need to get to the third or the fourth page before you see people. And I kid you not, it's amazing. If you see one solitary person standing on their own, it will probably be you have to, strain your eyes to actually see that person. That is how wild the perpetuation of that negative stereotype about Africa is. The misinformation is deeply troubling. You were going to say.
And, but it also speaks to another thing, because the deep-seated malice, and the malice was not just because out of pure hatred. It was pure hatred combined with economic agenda. See? You had to demonize people that you are going to colonize, people you're going to enslave. And that is the main reason behind it, that I want people never to forget that. There's always an economic agenda behind it. And because Africans were not in the business of going to Europe to colonize, to enslave, if they'd done that and used the same model, they would have depicted, they would have gone to find the Europeans that they want to depict as representing the image of Europe and Europeans. And they would do it in the same malicious manner in which Europeans did with regard to Africa. So there's an agenda behind it. It became an industry, in fact. In fact, in my book, there's one British explorer, so-called explorer, who told another one that, you should go to Africa and come back and write a book about your many conflicts, with the tribes, etc., etc. And that is why I call it manufacturing hate, because there was an agenda behind it. He's telling another European, what to write about, even before he went and engaged in any one of those activities. And he said the book would sell quite well.
And yes, could you also speak to the aid industry in Africa? We're talking about what perpetuates it, but the aid industry itself.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
I really detest it because, number one, there's no aid coming from the West to Africa. It is the other way around. But the thing is, when they send their so-called aid, it is announced the dollar amount, etc., etc. When ours is sent to Europe, to the United States, to Japan, to China, it is not announced that way because it's basically stolen resources.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, correct.
Gold has value. Diamond has value. Coltan cobalt, uranium, you name it, right?
Mhm.
Diamonds, bauxite, right? You name it. Gas, petroleum. So now it's only petroleum, perhaps that's a bit different because of OPEC. But when it comes to all other resources, right? Basically, Africans are getting nothing for those resources. So they're being robbed in two ways. They're being robbed when the resources are taken practically for nothing. They're not getting anything close to the real value for it, because if they were, most of those countries would have a higher standard of income, correct? Or at least revenue stream. That's number one. Then number two, they're getting robbed a second way. Since they've been prevented from industrializing, they buy all the manufactured products at exponentially greater prices relative to what they sell. So whether it's a smartphone, a computer, automobile, pharmaceuticals for the hospitals, anything produced from a factory. Even worse thing about it is that things that they can produce in Africa, they also import. They import bottled water. They import clothing, even though they produce cotton and they can make their own clothes, right? They import toothpaste. They import toothbrushes. The most nonsensical items that can be produced in Africa, right? So that's the second way in which they're robbed. And then also, but perhaps the biggest way actually that they're robbed is the damage that's been done to their mind. The mind is so damaged that they don't believe they can change this arrangement that continues to rob them. Then occasionally when a mind that is liberated, like a Thomas Sankara, comes forward, they make sure to liquidate him very quickly. Patrice Lumumba comes forward, liquidate.
Amilcar
Kwame Nkrumah
Cabral
comes forward, liquidate, overthrow him. And these are Africans who are saying the same thing. We can do it for ourselves. We can produce all these things. We can demand better prices for our resources. We can industrialize and stop importing the manufactured stuff that we can manufacture right here in Africa. You see?
Yep.
And part of it goes to the media that we discussed earlier. The purpose of the demonization is for financial reasons, for profit, for economic motives. It's not because I just hate black. I hate Africans. I can't stand that. No, that is largely a fiction maintained to justify the profits and financial gains.
Well, speaking of the aid industry, if you want to read more, you could read The Lords of Poverty, written by Graham Hancock.
I have that too, right. That is a good book.
It tells you that majority of the money you generate in the West in the name of the $2 a day, actually most of it goes into administration, where these guys will become directors in Africa, earning mouth-watering sums, and only for trickles to go to whatever it is they've pledged to come in and help ameliorate. Another one is Aid to Africa, Redeemer or Colonizer. It's a compilation of essays edited by Hakima Abbas and Yes Yigagira. And it's Samira Amin is there, Tim Moriti is there. I mean, big African writers basically telling you it's a scam. In not so blatant words, but essentially telling you
it's a scam. And I like the fact that now we have artists, musicians talking about that, because they have a way of reaching young people in a much more effective way.
Correct.
So in fact, I'm very eager to engage directly with these two artists, the Ghanaian and the British guy.
Yeah. Yes.
The Ghanaian British rather.
Yeah, so it's Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran is the British singer, and Fus, ODGB, is the name of the Ghanaian, but his real name is Nana Richard Abiona. And yes, speaking of reaching out and making amends, France, for our next story, we go to Senegal. For the news comes from AP. For the first time, France Macron calls 1944 killing of West African troops by French a massacre. And the story is filed in by Monica Prochek and Sylvia Colbert. Dakar, Senegal, AP. French President Emmanuel Macron on Thursday for the first time recognized the killing of West African soldiers by the French army in 1944 as a massacre in a letter addressed to the Senegalese authorities. Macron's move on the eve of the 80th anniversary of the World War II killings in Tiroir, a fishing village on the outskirts of the Senegalese capital of Dakar, comes as France's influence is declining in the region, with Paris losing its sway in the former French colonies in West Africa. Between 35 and 400 West African soldiers who fought for the French in Battle of France in 1940 were killed on December 1st, 1944 by French soldiers after what the French described as a mutiny over unpaid wages. The West Africans were members of the unit called Tirailleurs Senegalese, a corps of colonial infantry in the French army. According to historians, there are disputes over unpaid wages in the days before the massacre on December 1st. French troops turned on the French African soldiers, mostly unarmed, and shot and killed them. What do you think? Before my thoughts.
All right. There are many important things here. Number one, by officially acknowledging this, obviously, compensation must follow. And I'm sure that will be discussed.
Hopefully.
Right?
Hopefully.
For the descendants. Yeah, no, I think so. Because otherwise, it's meaningless. They've already opened themselves up to liability and obligation.
Okay.
The reason why they've not done so is because they were not ready to discuss compensation. So it suggests to me that they're ready to discuss some sort of compensation. Yeah, I mean, obviously, he's not an ignorant person. You know, this is a person who, the French president, is a person that has background in finance and economics. Yeah, he's an economist, I believe.
Yeah,
so
he
he
is.
understands these things. He understands these things.
He understands
That's
the
the
numbers.
important thing. Perhaps the most important thing. And then, of course, it also raises the question, how about other similar incidents in other French parts of the empire? And I guarantee you that is going to be the next thing we're going to be reading about. And some of the massacres, and I don't know how that has been dealt and resolved during the Algerian War, right?
That's still a long-running battle because they've not talked about compensation yet.
Okay, very good. So, okay. And then obviously you have Madagascar.
Yeah.
You know, Madagascar.
You have
In fact, we don't even know the extent of the horrific massacres in Madagascar. So that's going to be the next issue of discussion. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And the second point is something very, very troubling.
Which is
that the estimate is
to 400.
That's very troubling.
Why so?
When you give a range of 35 to 40. Okay, so maybe 5 people we could not account for. The bodies were missing. Even if you double it, 35 to 70, that's still troubling.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
How can you conceal the death of a number equal to 100% of the first range of the estimate, right? That's troubling. Now you're giving me a number which is more than 10 times the low range. 35 to 400. How do you even come up with a range like that? Think about it. You know, I say, if somebody dropped a bomb in the city, so the estimate of people who perished, maybe from 80 to 100, right?
Yeah.
Okay. 80 to 90. When they doubled it 80 to 160, you're like, wait, something is missing here. If they say 80 to 1,000, which is comparable to 35 to 400. No. Something is seriously wrong here.
So you think they're trying to downplay the number or protect themselves against
No, even worse than that.
How it looks.
Obviously there was a cover.
Yeah.
So they don't want to low bar by saying 35 to 40.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
They don't want to start with 300 to 400 either.
Sure.
Right? Because 300 plus, automatically, that's massacre on a genocidal proportion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yeah.
So you start with a low bar, 35. Okay. 35. The outrage is a bit muted. Correct?
Correct, yeah.
But if you're willing to go to 400, it suggests to me that the number is possibly even much more than 400. And that's why I'm very troubled by this range that is offered. And now it makes sense. Aha. Not only have you been suppressing it because you are afraid of opening Pandora's box, but you also suppress it because
the numbers
you
involved
wanted to protect the people who were responsible at the time that thing happened by downplaying the magnitude of this horrific thing. But I was always convinced that it must have been very horrific. After all, Usman Sembere made a
brilliant
film.
Yeah, brilliant film.
Camp de Tiaroye, which of course was banned. When it came out in 1988, it was banned in France for 10 years. Just like the Battle of Algiers, which was made in 1966, was banned until the 1970s. So a lot of interesting things are going on. And then the third thing I would like to say is obviously the new leadership
in Senegal.
Senegal, very responsible leadership, is
asking questions.
And then I have one other point after that. It's changed the dynamics in the relationship between Senegal
and France.
And obviously, to the benefit of Senegal, right? Senegal wants to end this neocolonial exploitation. And it picked on a topic that is so enduring and very historic. And I really appreciate the fact that Senegal, because it's not really France initiating it.
Sure.
It's France responding and trying to sort of preempt
what
Senegal is going to find out, because Senegal has appointed a commission with an eminent historian, Senegalese historian, to look at the facts of this incident that happened shortly after World War II.
One final question with regards to that. It's also important to know that Senegal is also thinking of expelling French troops from this base. Could that also be a way of softening their stance? I.e., okay, we've acknowledged a historical wrongdoing. Can we be allowed to stay? Because
I don't think that will happen. I think it will be too contradictory. The most obvious symbolic evidence of neocolonialism is to have foreign troops in your country. So I think you can't have the correct politics while you have that, It would be like a huge pimple right on the middle of your nose,
And ignoring the fact
that
that
will be talking to you, and they can't avoid focusing on that huge pimple. Yeah. It's one of the most inconvenient pimples. The one sitting on your nose and the one sitting on the corner of your lips. That's what it would be like for them. So I think they will go all the way. They will do it, but obviously they're doing it in a non-confrontational way.
Yeah,
and that's the difference between how they're doing.
Almost, forcing the French hand to say, it's obvious, you're the sad people we can see. So, Speaking of, you mentioned neocolonialism. Speaking of neocolonialism, we go to Angola for our next story, and which comes from, bear me a second. Yeah, it comes from the Money paper, the Financial Times. And it reads, Angola removes sanctioned Alrosa from its diamond mines ahead of U.S. visit. Russian state company's 41% stake was sold to an Omani-backed investment fund, Maiden. And the story is filed by Joseph Cottrell in London. Angola has removed the world's largest diamond miner, Russian state-owned Alrosa, from its mines ahead of a visit by U.S. President Joe Biden to the southern African country. The cabinet of Angola's President João Lourenço approved the sale of Alrosa's stake in a state-owned Angolan miner on Thursday because of sanctions on the Russian producer, Angola government media said. Alrosa's exit is a boost for U.S. effort to extend its global reach of sanctions and suggests Luanda, which is the capital of Angola, is moving closer to Washington after decades of ties to Moscow and Beijing. Oil-rich Angola is a significant exporter of crude to China and is also Beijing's biggest borrower in Africa. While its ruling MPLA party was a Soviet ally during the Cold War, under Lourenço, Angola has won U.S. backing for a rail corridor to transport copper from mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to the country's ports. Biden's visits next week will be the first by a U.S. president. Interesting. Chess moves. What say you, sir?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, obviously the timing. I think had the Angolans been confident that Biden was going to be reelected, obviously when you have something like having the Russians sell off their stake in the industry, it's something that probably started a while ago. It's not new, correct? So it really has nothing to do with the fact that Biden is going to be visiting. It had primarily with the fact that because of the sanctions against Russia by the U.S. and by the EU, Angola was concerned that it might be exposed to some sort of
sanction
not
itself,
direct but indirect sanctions as well. Yeah. And obviously, it also limited their capability of selling diamonds to the international market. But there's going to be dramatic change. Trump is going to force Ukraine to settle with Russia. Ukraine is going to, at least under Trump, is not going to regain the territory that Russia
has now annexed.
Or even occupied. The one annexed, I knew that one they were not going to get, but the one they're currently occupied, I don't know what's going to happen with that. You know, that might be part of the negotiation that, okay, the U.S., that Trump administration would say, we're willing to broker a deal where the Russians would keep the territory already annexed, but they should return the territory currently occupied.
So we're talking
withdraw.
So we're talking Crimea. Are we talking Crimea or the area in what's it called? The name escapes me now.
No, I'm talking about the ones that in the current conflict
they've taken over.
Extended.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, not the ones they've already been administering. That one, I don't think is even going to be on the table. You know? Well, it'll be on the table in the sense that the Russians will keep that. And I'm saying this not because this is my position. I'm saying this because of the statements that Trump has been making.
Okay.
So I'm reading his mind.
Okay.
Definitely, the Russians are going to benefit from a Trump administration in this conflict with Ukraine. Trump was complaining throughout in terms of the amount of money and weapons that the United States had been sending to Ukraine. You know, he said that Zelensky is the world's best salesman. Every time he comes to the U.S., he walks back home with billions of dollars of our money.
Wow.
Anybody can research and look that. Trump said that many, many times. So, and his son tweeted a few days ago that, you know, the countdown has begun to when your allowance is going to be cut off. That's what he was telling Zelensky.
Wow.
This is the president's son.
Wow.
The incoming president's son.
So it's
saying that.
It's almost like your man.
So in other words, Ukraine is going to have no choice but to settle with Russia. And once Ukraine settles with Russia, the EU countries would come along because it is primarily the U.S. that has been pushing this war. You see? The EU, many of those countries want to, resume their business deals with Russia. Many of them, absolutely. They depend on energy from Russia. So they can't wait for Trump to, compel Ukraine to negotiate and settle with Russia either. I say all this suggests that this would then affect Angola as well. And if Angola was aware that this were the things that were going to transpire, perhaps they would not have even forced Alrosa, the Russian mining company, to sell their interest in the Angolan enterprise. That's what I wanted to suggest.
Okay, so if that were the case, in terms of Angola's situation now with Russia, with Beijing, quote unquote, with the incoming administration, where does that put the issue of sanctions on the former president's daughter, the story we did last week?
The president of who?
The Dos Santos' daughter, who is being sanctioned by the British.
Oh, no, that's not effective. Trump is not going to get involved in that.
So you don't think he will cut a deal?
Oh, no, because she stole substantial resources, allegedly. Mm-hmm. If those resources can be traced, Angola would like to have that money, back. The only sense that back in the day, you had some leeway and bargaining.
Okay.
The thief could negotiate and said, for XYZ, I will tell you where I hid the money, you see? And then they'll say, okay. And this has been done. I forget which countries, but this has been done where the thieves actually were allowed to keep some of the money for helping the authorities in African countries trace the bulk of it, you see? Okay, show us, help us retrieve it, you keep 5%, return 95% to the government, right? But nowadays, that deal is off the table because now it's even hard to hide stolen money in Swiss banks. You have the offshore banks, of course, you have that. But now you have the U.S. and basically with Angola having good relations, they can put pressure on a lot of those havens that people used to hide money to.
So speaking of havens and potential sticking points, we go to Mauritius for our next and final story. And it's essentially from the money paper, Financial Times, and it reads, Mauritius raised concern about UK's plan to cede sovereignty over Chaguan's island. And for those who are not familiar, this island was a group of islands in the sea, all called in total about 60 islands, and one of which is one of the biggest military bases that the United States and the UK, operates in the Indian Ocean. It reads, the new government of Mauritius has raised concern over UK's plan to secure a key US military base after giving up sovereignty of the Chaguan Islands. People familiar with the thinking said, British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is seeking to finalize a long-term lease over the Diego Garcia base on the Indian Ocean Islands after a deal to relinquish control was agreed with previous Mauritian leader last month. However, since then, Mauritius' opposition party has won power in a landslide election, forcing a new government led by Navin Ragulam, who previously called the deal high treason. The sticking point is the new administration is set to debate concern about the deal, including length of the 99-year lease and the UK's right to renew it in the coming weeks. After meeting Powell, Ragulan said he needed more time to study details of the agreement struck by his predecessor Prashid Jugnauth with legal advisors. What do you think will happen here? I mean, I can understand his concerns, but I also see a downside to the holding out. I mean, I'm looking out for the people now.
Well, it's still not clear to me what the new incoming and the new government in Mauritius wants,
Okay, for them, it's the 19-year...
What are they mainly...
They're concerned.
Why are they opposing this
Okay,
deal?
so
What are the elements
so
that
it's
they
two
don't like
it's
the
two
most?
it's two-pronged actually. One is the issue of the length of the lease and the sums involved, because they think
The amount they're going to be paid.
yes, because they think they're owed some back payments, and also the sticking point is you cannot just write 99 years and get us to sign it off.
Right. Okay. Well, they seem to be legitimate concerns.
Okay.
But now, what side will the U.S.?
Yes. Good question. Good question.
You know, the U.S. has, what, a 99-year lease on Guantanamo Bay?
Yep.
So it's not like they're unfamiliar with wanting those kind of, extortionist long-term leases. Then on the other hand, if
Trump is an isolationist, what does that mean for...
Yeah, but the U.S. has vital interest in the region too.
Okay.
So his generals can convince him that, for military purposes, for national security, this isn't just like slapping tariffs on China and Mexico and Canada, which is a different thing, which of course is going to have some issues with as well, coming from businesses, who are afraid of because they're going to be basically businesses, they're never harmed, because what they do is they shift the burden on the consumers, right? So, but that's a different issue. This one involves, military, strategic. On the one hand, I mean, I can see why if the incoming government think they can get a better deal, then they should go for it, you see?
Okay.
But on the other hand, if they are government today, any deals that they make and they put their signature to should be honored, which means the previous government that put their signature on that deal
basically tie their hands.
I mean, that deal should be honored as well.
Okay.
And if it came to international arbitration, I think the British would probably prevail and say a legitimate government signed off on this and we ratified it.
Okay.
I imagine the legitimate government at the time in Mauritius also had it ratified. That's not mentioned in the article, but I presume it did. Otherwise, it would not even be an issue for these guys to bring up. They would have just said, well, it was never ratified. We don't honor that agreement. But they're not saying that, which means Mauritius already
done the deed,
ratified that agreement. And, when it comes to international issues like this, it's going to be difficult to get it reversed unless you can show and have the evidence of some sinister activities that went on, allowed this deal to be signed, which you are claiming is harmful to the country's interests, and then you produce that evidence, then I can see how you can take this to, International Court of Justice.
I agree with that line in the sense that for the issue to even have a reason is because the UK then decided, there was a humanitarian ground to allow people back on the island and to give the island back. For you now to hold up on the basis of the length of a lease and possible remuneration would not paint the opposition government in good light. I mean, yes, you have a mandate from the people to deal on their behalf, but it will also be counterproductive, image-wise.
On the other hand, the British might be willing to say, okay, if they want more money, we can throw in a little extra thing. And that part of the deal, and I imagine nobody would refuse more money. If the British say that particular aspect of the deal, we are willing to take a look at. But the lease, we are not willing to take a look at, and that's already been signed. But the money thing, I think we're able to address a few more billion pounds here.
Yeah, because I think the UK government would be, because, it's been a long-running saga. The issue of the people who were displaced, the nature of how they were displaced.
Right, and you notice this story does not even cover that. They didn't even mention that. See?
So that in itself, the government will want to see the end of the, So I think they won't balk at the idea of just topping up any difference that the present government might want to bring up.
Right.
So yes, speaking of bringing up, we come up to the end of another episode of African News Review. And we hope you've all enjoyed it. If this is your first time here, do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We're hoping to get to 1,000 by the turn of the year. But that said, all we can ask is each one bring one. We're aiming to give voice to stories in the media, deconstruct them, as we've done this last 5 stories and as we've done a couple of weeks back. You can watch all the back episodes on this channel. But it's important that we give voice to our agency in the media, because just like we talked about the massacre in 1944, expulsion of French troops from Chad, these things will not be highlighted in our media. Why? Because it doesn't pay them to show themselves in bad light. So they have to spin the story, make you the passive, and almost as if they're doing you charity. And we've all learned of how charity is skewed when it comes to the African setup. So again, I thank Comrade Milton and Allimadi for coming through once again. And
yes, sir.
Final words?
Liberate your mind, fellow Africans. Liberate the mind, and you'll see the amazing things we'll do to transform our beloved continent.
Yes. From me, I'll go with the words of Chinua Achebe, who said, stories are always innocent. Stories are always innocent, but depending on who is holding the story, it's usually one of dispossession. And as you've seen the series of our stories here, it's always wanting to paint a bad light of who we are in order to take what we have and in some cases make us just disappear. So thank you all for coming through. Again, until next week, it is good night for now. And Brother Milton, victory asset. And thank you for coming through.
Thank you, sir.
That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.